So we're absolutely thrilled to have Caroline Struthers to speak to us. She is a Senior EQUATOR Research Fellow at the UK EQUATOR Centre, University of Oxford. Caroline, sorry, I wasn't sure if you were the senior or a senior.
A
senior. I got that right. Just thought I'd check. She is an ME/C.F.S patient ally, brilliant one, and blogs about the PACE trial and Cochrane at healthycontrol.org, which you can check out. So today she's going to tell us about her experience as an activist, from a position of ignorance to becoming a determined and vocal critic of establishment-backed research into ME/CFS. And she's going to bring the story up to date with a focus on Cochrane and NICE. So welcome, Caroline. Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Right, I shall just
off you go.
Share screen thing.
And I'll do the round of applause on behalf of everybody.
Right, hello everyone, and thank you very much indeed for inviting me to speak at your after your AGM. My name is Caroline Struthers, and I'm a research fellow at the UK EQUATOR Centre at the University of Oxford. Bit of background on EQUATOR. It's an international organisation dedicated to improving the quality of health research, primarily by promoting the use of reporting guidelines. And reporting guidelines are lists of the essential details researchers need to include when they are writing up their work, so readers can easily understand why they did it, what they did, and what they found. I first got involved in health research in 2008 when I got a job at the Cochrane Pain and Palliative Care Review Group. And I was really excited to work for an organisation which seemed to be doing something incredibly sensible, which is to find and summarise all the research on healthcare treatments, and therefore get as close to the truth as possible about whether they work or not. So randomised trials are considered the best type of research to test treatments fairly. My first role in Cochrane was to help review authors by searching research databases for records of completed trials on whichever treatment the review was investigating. And although I'd never done a job like it, and it was complex and demanding, I really enjoyed it, and I also loved being part of the Cochrane family. When I started the job, I was spectacularly ignorant about trials and medical research in general. However, I soon caught on to the importance of randomisation and other ways of reducing bias. And I assumed that if a trial was randomised, and other methods were used to reduce bias, the results were automatically trustworthy. Shortly after I started at Cochrane, a scandal broke in pain research. A professor of anesthesiology called Scott Rubin had published 21 journal articles reporting positive results of trials, and these were trials which had actually never been conducted. He often co-wrote papers where other authors didn't know about or participate in the studies, and their names were forged on documents. My colleagues, some of whom had written Cochrane reviews which included these data from these trials, took this news surprisingly well. It was a bit sort of calm down, dear, you know. I was getting hot under the collar about this, and didn't seem to be worried. They said that taking out the data from Rubin's trials didn't change the conclusions of their reviews very much, and that was the end of that. Even my fellow information specialists in other review groups seemed relatively unconcerned. There was hardly a ripple. I found this very odd, considering how serious Rubin's crime was. Yeah, so this article on the slide, I found it fairly recently, and I was surprised by that he, of all people, thought that people who are more imaginative about distorting scientific evidence than Rubin was are worthy of respect. Another thing that troubled me early on was the tolerance of review authors with an obvious allegiance to the treatment they were reviewing. For example, I worked on a review of homeopathy for the side effects of cancer treatment, which was led by the then Director of Complementary Cancer Services at the Royal London Homeopathic Hospital, which is now called the Royal London Hospital for Integrated Medicine. So I checked recently, and the same doctor is still listed as specialising in homeopathy. Her professional biography also still features her role as lead on the Cochrane review I worked on in 2009, which has never been updated. And she seems to be using the review as a kind of selling tool. When I questioned why our group allowed a doctor who uses homeopathy in her practice to lead a Cochrane review, no one seemed to think it was a problem. When the review was published, it gave a cautious thumbs up to homeopathy on the basis of about 4 small trials. And when I questioned this, I was told that the author had originally been even more positive, and the Cochrane editor had had to tone down the enthusiasm. So the criminal fraud of trialists like Scott Rubin and the researcher allegiance to that can bias the findings of Cochrane reviews was a shock and a disappointment to me. And I realised it would be perfectly possible for Cochrane's review authors to use Cochrane's reputation for being the gold standard to cover up problems in the research on treatments they believed in, rather than calling them out. In 2010, I jumped at the opportunity to manage a Cochrane public engagement project, which focused on educating carers of people with dementia about the importance of evidence, so they could advocate for better research and advocate for evidence-based treatments for their loved ones. And looking back, I think it reflected a desire to tell the world about the problems I'd seen in my short time working for Cochrane, particularly the people who were directly affected, so patients, carers, and the general public. Ironically, I was now uncovering problems in dementia research which directly and negatively affected my mother, who was diagnosed when I was working on the project. After the project finished, I continued working at Cochrane for a while, banging my head against the brick wall, trying to get them to acknowledge their reviews were of limited use when most of the data from trials was untrustworthy, irrelevant, or absent. I wanted to persuade Cochrane to shift their focus from wrangling dodgy data from tiny, poorly conducted trials into meta-analyses and put more emphasis on rooting out poor research that was polluting their reviews. I wanted them to do more to help improve trials on which Cochrane reviews depend. And in 2014, me and my bruised head moved to EQUATOR. And EQUATOR seemed to be a more constructive organisation in that it aims to improve research by encouraging researchers to be open and transparent. And EQUATOR is also the perfect environment for my obsession with research misconduct to develop. So it was in September 2016, though, things really took off. I posted a link to an article by science writer Julie Raymeyer on my personal Facebook page. It was called "Bad Science Misled Millions with Chronic Fatigue Syndrome. Here's how we fought back." I wrote a short comment on the post about how shocking I thought it was that it took such a long time and effort to force researchers to release the data from a publicly funded trial. This trial, of course, was the PACE trial. Analysis of the data that was eventually released refuted the positive findings reported in The Lancet in 2011. And as I'm sure that all of you are aware, PACE was a £5 million trial funded mainly by the UK Medical Research Council, but with a significant contribution from the UK's Department of Work and Pensions. It compared the effectiveness of CBT and graded exercise therapy with standard medical care and pacing. Pulling the strings were powerful establishment psychologists and psychiatrists who had been pushing the theory that the condition was perpetuated by psychological factors which could be overcome with exercise and psychological therapies, designed to reprogram the false beliefs that there were biological factors involved. It was billed by them and sold to the government as a definitive trial and concluded that both treatments were superior to pacing and standard care. It conveniently backed up what was already recommended in the 2007 NICE guidelines. What I didn't know at the time was that the 2007 NICE guidelines were based on expert opinion, the opinion of the same psychiatrists and psychologists who had built their careers on delivering these treatments via the NHS and telling everyone they worked. The The day after my Facebook post, I was surprised and upset when a slightly threatening negative response to my post popped up from a person I'd met professionally called Lilbeth Larun. And she said I should be careful about the statements I make and that she had also reanalyzed the data from PACE. I had no idea why Larun would object to such a post, which was obviously a personal view and in celebration of patient power. To make things even worse, she wrote to my boss to complain about the post, and I was called into my boss's office on Monday morning to explain myself. I was intimidated by the fact that Larun would consider this a matter to bring up with my employer. I never saw her email, except apparently my behaviour was not what she expected from me as a representative of the EQUATOR network. My boss at the time was diplomatic and replied to Larun, defending my right to say what I thought about the public's right to have access to the data from a publicly funded trial. A few months before I had posted the Bad Science article, I read this article by a very persuasive article about PACE written by Simon Wesley. I must confess, at the time, I swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. After the Larun incident, I went back and read Wesley's article again. This time, I also read the hundreds of comments underneath it, the vast majority of which were very critical of PACE. So I then tried to work out what Larun was talking about. Why should she be reanalyzing the data from PACE? I then discovered she was the lead author of a Cochrane review of exercise therapy for chronic fatigue syndrome. The largest study included in the review was, of course, the PACE trial. Her version of the review was originally published in 2014 and concluded that exercise was a helpful treatment. I noticed that the lead investigator of the PACE trial, Professor Peter White, was a named advisor on the Cochrane review. How on earth could Cochrane provide an unbiased critical appraisal of PACE if the primary investigator of PACE was providing them with advice? One good thing about Cochrane reviews is the post-publication feedback system. So anyone can submit feedback, and in theory, the authors are obliged to respond. There are now at least 14 sets of feedback, including detailed and well-argued critiques from the late Robert Courtney and Tom Kindlin. Robert Courtney, frustrated by the poor response of the authors to his comments on the review, submitted a formal complaint. This was judged by the editor-in-chief of Cochrane, David Tovey, to be thoughtful and reasonable. An internal investigation of the points raised in Courtney's complaint led Tovey to announce the temporary withdrawal of the review in October 2018. Then a massive media storm erupted, where Cochrane was accused of caving to patient activists. David Tovey denied it was about patient pressure and said the withdrawal was to give the authors time to respond to several points in Courtney's complaint, which raised issues that need to be addressed. However, he was persuaded by the review authors to keep the review on the Cochrane library whilst they amended the review for about the millionth time. I'd started writing to Tovey myself about the review from late 2016. He was already used to me writing to complain about other Cochrane reviews where I could see that the allegiance of the review authors distorted the findings of the review, created misleading positive spin about favoured treatments. After being fobbed off by Tovey and others at Cochrane for 2 years, I finally submitted a formal complaint about the review to the governing board and asked for it to be withdrawn. They refused to engage with the complaint and referred it straight back to Tovey. When he responded, he said my reviews on the poor methods and obvious bias of the review were a matter of opinion, not shared by the authors, obviously, or Cochrane methodologists. However, this was not true, as he had already tried and failed to withdraw the review because of the issues raised in Courtney's complaint. The only thing I could really do then was appeal again to the governing board. and they responded to say that the editor-in-chief had acted and continues to act in the best interests of Cochrane and in a manner that best serves the public as a whole. I would certainly agree that he acted in the best interests of Cochrane. In May 2019, when David Tovey was just about to retire, the authors finally submitted the amended version of the review. In correspondence obtained via Freedom of Information, it emerged that Tovey had responded to say that he could not accept a quality rating of moderate on the outcome of fatigue, and he said it was indefensible and it should be downgraded to low or very low. This one rating of moderate on the one outcome of fatigue allowed them to conclude that exercise was probably helpful. His email said that Cochrane proposed to withdraw the review and even suggested wording for the announcement. Atle Fredheim, who was managing the negotiations with Cochrane, is director of the Norwegian Institute of Public Health and boss of two of the review authors, including Larun. Fredheim refused to accept Tovey's decision. The tone of the correspondence, which I've read in full, is bullying and disrespectful to Tovey, in my opinion. But as the Norwegian Institute of Public Health is also the host and funder of Cochrane Norway, I guess he felt he could take the offensive from a position of power. When David Tovey left Cochrane at the end of May, the issue was still unresolved, and Carla Suarez-Weiser took over as editor-in-chief. Fredheim then suggested an arbitrator to settle the dispute. So Cochrane wanted the authors to downgrade the evidence quality rating on the outcome of fatigue from moderate to low, as advised by numerous unbiased people. The authors wanted to keep the moderate rating. An editor from Cochrane Norway called Andy Oxman had suggested Gordon Guyat act as this arbitrator. So Gordon Guyat is the co-founder of the grade system, which is used to grade the quality of evidence in all Cochrane reviews. Tovey and his advisors had already said that the moderate rating was indefensible. Suarez-Weiser and Fredheim said they would abide by Guyat's judgment on whether the moderate rating should be downgraded to low or could stay as moderate. The correspondence I mentioned contains a lot of lobbying argument from Fredheim justifying keeping the moderate rating. It seems that Guyat is persuaded that the moderate rating can stand, but it is contingent on them highlighting that the effect is not important. He made this absolutely clear in a message which Fredheim was copied in on. By now, Suarez-Weiser was obviously in a massive hurry to get this situation settled. So she wrote to confirm with Fredheim that the rating of moderate was for a non-zero effect. Guyat was not copied into this correspondence. She said nothing about the requirement to highlight that it was not an important effect in the text of the review. Fredheim then wrote back to Carla saying that they would take out any mention of effect size. This is not the same as highlighting there is no important effect. So Fredheim has cleverly manipulated Guyat and Cochrane to keep the desired quality rating of moderate without having to highlight that the effect is clinically meaningless. Nearly 4 months later, in October, Cochrane published the amended review. It watered down the positive conclusions, and there is now an acknowledgement that the eligibility criteria of the trial populations could have included people who didn't have ME. And from saying exercise therapy is probably safe, the review now says there's not enough evidence, not enough data to tell whether it's safe or not. But the main message is still that exercise could be helpful. The authors added one short sentence in a footnote to a summary table containing this moderate rating, which allows them to comment that the exercise therapy probably reduces fatigue after 12 to 26 weeks. It is only if you bother to read the footnote that you will see they can only say this reduction is non-zero, i.e. it will not make any important difference to patients. There is no mention in the discussion, let alone a highlight as required by Guyot, that the effect was not clinically important. I'm sure Ben Goldacre would be very respectful of this sneaky trick to mislead readers of the review. Alongside the amended review, Suarez-Weiser wrote a news story saying Cochrane realised there were still problems with the review and they would be embarking on an update. She acknowledged problems and committed to doing a new review and to forging better relationships with patients. In February 2020, Cochrane appointed a well-known patient advocate and Cochrane co-founder, Hilda Bastian, to lead an independent advisory group to advise on an update of the review. I responded with enthusiasm to Bastian's call for commentary and feedback on the previous review and the proposed update, as did many others. My main argument was that an update of the exercise review was totally pointless. Cochrane were obviously aware that NICE had embarked on an update of the clinical guideline for ME/C.F.S. The final scope was published in October 2018. So Cochrane would know that NICE would be doing a comprehensive independent evidence review of all potential treatments for ME/C.F.S. What could Cochrane possibly add by doing their own review? Bastian rejected my argument, telling me that as Cochrane had decided to do it, she was committed to the project and would go ahead with it as planned, whatever I or anyone else said. When NICE published the draft of the new ME/C.F.S. guideline 2 years later in November 2020, it included a 356-page evidence review on the evidence for all non-pharmacological treatments, including exercise and CBT. So NICE often use Cochrane reviews to inform their own evidence reviews. But in this case, they couldn't use either of the two Cochrane reviews, one on exercise and one on CBT, because they didn't include critical outcomes and included trials where not all participants had ME/C.F.S. Also, the CBT for C.F.S. review was written in 2008. The NICE review also concluded that evidence from the randomized trials for both exercise therapy and CBT, including the PACE trial, ranged from low quality to very low quality. So these findings have led to a reversal of the recommendations for exercise and CBT to treat ME/C.F.S. So I decided to write to Cochrane again and ask them to withdraw both the exercise review and the CBT review. Before writing, I checked the withdrawal policy and found out then that Cochrane had changed the policy in August 2019, exactly a month after I and a person with ME had met with Suarez-Weiser in Oxford. This person had been corresponding with Cochrane about the exercise review since 2013. We begged Suarez-Weiser to withdraw the exercise review and not publish the amendment. Neither of us had any idea about the behind-the-scenes negotiations which had been going on the month before in June, and that Suarez-Weiser had already committed to publishing the amendment. The withdrawal policy change means it's much more difficult to withdraw a Cochrane review. And I've found the timing of the policy change very suspicious. However, the withdrawal policy still states that if a serious error means that following the findings of a review could cause harm to patients, then a review can be withdrawn. As NICE had found no evidence of benefit and credible evidence of harm, following the findings of the Cochrane reviews, which both state that exercise therapy and CBT may be helpful for ME/C.F.S, could result in harm to patients. After a lot of toing and froing, predictably, my request was rejected. A Cochrane editorial committee decided that there was no serious error in either the exercise review or the CBT review. They seemed unconcerned that patients could be harmed by following the findings of the review, which contradicted the new NICE guidelines. One small win was when I questioned the decision the CEO of Cochrane eventually instructed the Cochrane editors to put a notice on the CBT review to say it was out of date, would not be updated, and should not be used for clinical decision-making. How ridiculous for a Cochrane review to stay on the library with a do not use notice on it. There are, of course, hundreds of reviews on the Cochrane library which are out of date and never going to be updated. But the new Cochrane policy now says that they can stay on the Cochrane library forever. After the draft of the new NICE guideline went out for consultation, critics came out in force, including prominent establishment figures such as Gordon Guyatt. This article, which was a rapid response to a criticism of the NICE guidelines, claims there's been a disastrous misapplication of grade, quoting the Cochrane review where Guyatt had endorsed the indefensible rating of moderate quality evidence. Another author of that article criticising NICE was Paul Garner. He's another Cochrane co-founder. I knew him a little from when I worked at Cochrane, and we've had good lively discussions about research misconduct scandals and potential harm to patients. So I was surprised when he got in touch with me out of the blue in July 2020, saying he was worried about having long COVID and the possibility of developing ME. He agreed, using quite colourful language, that the Cochrane exercise review was not good. I was over the moon at the time that at last I'd found an ME ally in the Cochrane elite. Yet again, my hopes were dashed. I'm very glad he recovered from long COVID, but he puts it down to having a chat with a Norwegian lightning process guru on the phone and then using the power of his conscious mind to recover. After that, he went rogue on Twitter and in other media, saying that the Cochrane exercise review is a good review and not shite after all. Excuse my language, but it was his language. And unlike me, he has escaped the grip of the ME C.F.S activist rhetoric. All I have done, along with many others, is criticise appallingly bad science. No rhetoric is needed. But he seems happy to make unevidenced claims that the NICE process for producing the new ME C.F.S guideline was a travesty. With every step of the NICE process exhaustively documented and made public, I don't know what planet he's living on to call them corrupt. It's also deeply ironic considering that a person connected with the Royal College of Psychiatrists covertly texted the chief executive of NICE, with whom they are on first name terms, to try and persuade her to retrospectively tamper with the NICE evidence after the guideline had already been agreed and signed off by her own executive team. This person is widely believed to be Simon Wesley. This text message was revealed via another Freedom of Information request, as with the correspondence between Cochrane and the Norwegian Institute of Public Health over the exercise review. I think you can see a theme developing here, and it's not a theme of prioritising patient safety or of openness and honesty. The theme seems to be saving face for powerful people in the medical establishment. Going back to the update of the exercise review, it's now nearly 3 years since Hilda announced that she was leading an independent advisory group to advise Cochrane on the new review. We were promised monthly updates, consultations, a new protocol, transparency. But since July 2021, having produced only 3 reports, there has been no communication at all on what's happening. Ever the optimist, I am still hoping Cochrane will abandon the update and withdraw both the exercise and CBT reviews. I have continued to write to Cochrane and others regularly. For example, last year, Cochrane and NICE signed an agreement to share data and analyses with each other. I asked NICE if they were happy for Cochrane to provide data, including quality assessments, when there is no independent oversight of their work. And in the case of the exercise review, Cochrane judged the quality of evidence from the PACE trial as moderate, when NICE judged it as low or very low. I also asked Cochrane if they will ask NICE to share the data and analyses from their evidence review to inform the new Cochrane update. Cochrane told me in June that they are considering this, but they had no further information to share. There has also been a priority setting partnership for ME/CFS undertaken by the James Lind Alliance and funded by the NHS. In common with all priority setting partnerships, it was led by people with ME/CFS, their carers and clinicians. The aim was to identify the top 10 research priorities to influence research funding and activity in the future. Exercise did not make it to the top 10 or even the long list. I wrote to Dr. Bastian in June to ask if Cochrane would abandon the review update and withdraw the misleading 2019 review. I haven't heard back yet. So I've now had 14 years working for and interacting with research organisations such as Cochrane, who all claim to have patients and the public at the centre of what they do. I've discovered that scientific studies such as trials and systematic reviews designed to provide trustworthy evidence for effectiveness of healthcare treatments are given more credibility if they report results supporting the establishment view. Critics of poor science are branded anti-science activists, whilst the people responsible for it do dodgy behind-the-scenes manipulations, which I'm sure Ben Goldacre would find admirable. This has been particularly shocking in the case of ME/CFS research. In none of the extensive correspondence with Cochrane and other organisations who say they exist for the benefit of patients and the public, has anyone expressed any concern for patients at all. They've consistently argued black is white to avoid acknowledging there is anything seriously wrong with PACE or with the Cochrane reviews or with their own organisations. They have prioritised protecting those with vested interests in ineffective and potentially harmful treatments over the protection of patients. This is the depressing conclusion I've come to. But I have been lucky to be cheered on and advised in my efforts by many people, too many to name, but they know who they are, and they may be listening today, especially those on the marvellous Science for ME forum. They make me determined to carry on, and thank you to them, and thank you to you for listening today.